It's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Bristol Festival of Ideas, on behalf of UWE Philosophy, and on behalf of UWE Social Science in the City. Let me start by giving a quick thank you to the generous funders of this event. So, of course, I already mentioned UWE Social Science in the City, but also I'd like to mention the Royal Institute of Philosophy and also the Czech Center in London. Europe is facing an existential crisis. So began a recent manifesto written by 15 prominent economists and published in The Guardian last week. Everywhere we hear the language of European crisis. Economic, social, political, environmental, it goes on and on. And yet, as Europe prepares to go to the polls in an election that will have a heavy impact on how this crisis is addressed, and as the UK prepares and is already in the process of contemplating a possible future outside of political Europe, that is, outside of the European Union, in the midst of this situation, this very serious situation, there is very little understanding and perhaps even less agreement on the sense or the meaning of Europe, the subject of this crisis. So I propose to you that we have precious little idea about what Europe means, even less idea about what Europe should do, what role or task it has in the world, and if it even exists in the relevant sense. These are the questions that I think are implicated or are involved when we ask what is the meaning of Europe. And this is what it means, I think, to say that Europe is facing an existential crisis. This brings me to introduce our speakers for the evening. And given the scale of the task that I've just presented to you, I certainly do not envy them. My role here is much simpler than theirs. It's my great pleasure, first of all, to introduce His Excellency, the Ambassador of the Czech Republic to the United Kingdom, Michael Zantovský. The ambassador was a founding member of the Civic Forum, the umbrella organization that coordinated the overthrow of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia and the peaceful transfer of power during the Velvet Revolution. He subsequently served as press secretary, spokesman, and political director for the President Václav Havel. In 2003, he founded a Prague-based think tank, the Program of Atlantic Security Studies, and served as its first executive director. Ambassador Zantovský later returned to the Foreign Service, serving as ambassador to the United States, to Israel, and now to the United Kingdom. He is not only a politician and a diplomat, but also an intellectual. He is not that those things would be exclusive to one another. He's translated more than 50 works of contemporary English and American literature into Czech, and he's also, I found this very interesting, published a book on the life and films of Woody Allen. The ambassador will be responded to by two very bright and very important young political theorists. I say young because I consider myself still young as well. So Dr. Anya Topolsky from the University of Leuven and Dr. Teresa Pulano from Rome. The setup of tonight's event is that there will be a talk from Ambassador Zantovský that will be followed by short replies from Anya and Teresa, and then we will open the debate. And our idea tonight really is to stimulate a debate. It's really to have a discussion on this very important question of what is the meaning of Europe. So I ask you, please don't be shy. Please say whatever it is that you have to say on the issue. This is the time to speak your mind. This is the time to get it out, to discuss it. And really, this is a time for us to decide and to debate the meaning and also the future of Europe. So with that, I pass the floor to the ambassador. Thank you very much.
I will struggle with the technology a little. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. It is really a great honor and pleasure. I'm not sure how much I will be able to contribute to your subject. This is a conference, a philosophical conference on the meaning of Europe, and I'm not a philosopher, I'm a diplomat. And in some respects, the two disciplines are directly opposed, whereas philosophers search for the true meaning of the phenomena, diplomats are often busy trying to obscure it. However, they shouldn't be able to obscure the fact that some of the questions posed by philosophy in its quest for meaning bear direct relevance on the issues of our contemporary world, including political issues and issues regarding Europe in particular. In this sense, this conference about the meaning of Europe, the very idea of Europe, couldn't have come at a more opportune time. At probably no other time in the historically brief existence of the European Union, of which both your country and mine are members, was the question of its meaning as relevant and at the same time as acutely challenged as today, what with the large parts of the continent still reeling from the effects of the financial crisis, with our idea of Europe directly challenged by an alternative vision of Europe or Eurasia, as witnessed by the events in Ukraine, with some people seeing the solution to the European problems in the deepening of the European integration, eventually forming a federal Europe, while other people wish to solve the same problems by backing away from the current format of the European Union and returning to a looser form of intergovernmental cooperation within the single market and a few other areas of cooperation. And with the election to the European Parliament a few weeks away, with a strong possibility of general indifference, contrasted by a massive protest vote in not 1 or 2, but maybe 10 or 12 member countries. In other words, Europe is in crisis. And as many people have observed, crisis is not only a major headache, but also a time when serious questions are sometimes posed and answers are occasionally found. Now, what can philosophy, and in particular the ideas of some of my countrymen, offer in this respect? I understand that one of the topics of this conference is the body of thought of a philosopher, Jan Patočka, a native of Prague, whose thought had informed the Czechoslovak democratic opposition in the years before 1989, and whose lectures I was lucky enough to attend in the brief period of liberalization during the Prague Spring of 1968 as a freshman student at the Faculty of Philosophy in Prague and in private homes afterwards. Mind you, that does not make me a philosopher. I graduated in clinical and social psychology and spent most of the next 10 years in a mental institution, which I still believe provided the best training for politics and diplomacy one could conceivably get. But I have had enough to carry away a lasting impression of being in the presence of a remarkable mind and an even more remarkable man who chose the life of ideas and who was even more remarkably able to live and die by those ideas. Patočka's work on Europe and post-Europe, what he called in German Europa and nach Europa, bore a direct relevance to our topic today and was also influential in the formation of the thought of another remarkable man, Václav Havel, the leader of the democratic opposition and after 1989, the president of Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic, and I'm proud to say a close friend of mine, but is itself, or was itself, a part of a longer thread of thought in which my hometown, Prague, seems to play the role of the spiritus loci. Patočka was a pupil and follower of Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, whose 1935 Prague lecture, Philosophy and the Crisis of European Man, and the 1936 work, The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology, constituted a direct stimulus for Patočka's thinking on Europe. For Patočka, as Husserl, the point of departure for the European thought was the observation of the dual character of this quintessential European invention, the European rationalism and the deification of knowledge, as both a method of understanding the world, but also of conquering it. For Patočka, the crisis of European science and thought consisted in the looming split between the two, resulting, and I will quote, on the one hand, in knowledge of the given without self-control, and on the other hand, in striving for unity, universality, eternity, while overlooking or neglecting the given. End of quote. In Patočka's view, Europe has given up on insight and understanding for the sake of success or for what it calls progress. The result is rationality without soul. But only soul and care for the soul, as Patočka calls it, can give birth to culture and community. Indeed, for Patočka, community is an outward expression of the soul. The other contribution of Patočka, of vital importance during the communist days, but of continuing importance afterwards, is the centrality of moral values for the preservation and flourishing of a society. In his short essay on the duty to resist injustice, published in the Defense of the Charter 77 in January 1977, he writes, quote, "No society, no matter how technologically advanced, can function without a moral basis, a conviction which is not a matter of opportunity, circumstances, or anticipated benefits," unquote. At the same time, he rejects the rationalistic view of morality as an instrument of social order, going on to say, quote, "However, morality is not here for the society to function, but simply because it makes a human being human," unquote. In Václav Havel, Patočka found a follower who not only espoused similar views, but made the same effort to make practical use of them in both his life as a dissident and during his time as president. In The Power of the Powerless, his best-known essay, he formulates a strategy of liberation to escape the alienation consisting in what he called living the lie of the totalitarian system. But in the second part of this essay, he extrapolates on the question by posing the need to overcome the alienation and what he calls the automatism of modern technological society in general, not just in the communist countries, but in Western societies in general. In his thinking, that is to say, the totalitarian system was always just a malignant outgrowth of the rationalist post-Enlightenment worldview which attaches premium to success and knowledge at the cost of insight and comprehension. In his speech to the French Academy of Humanities and Political Sciences in October 1992, at one of the lowest points in his political career, 3 months after he resigned the Czechoslovak presidency in protest against the impending split of the country in 1992, at the end of 1992, in a direct refutation of the 11th thesis on Feuerbach of Karl Marx about the duty of philosophers not just to explain the world but to change it, he reminded his august listeners, and I quote, "The world, being, and history have their own time. We can, of course, enter that time in a creative way, but none of us has it entirely in his hands. If I consider my own political impatience, I realize with new urgency that a politician of the present and the future must learn, in the deepest and best sense of the word, the importance of waiting. His actions cannot be based on a sense of superiority, but must spring from humility. Even I, the sarcastic critic of all those who vainly attempt to explain the world, had to remind myself that the world cannot just be explained, it must be understood as well, not changed, but understood. In his speech to the joint session of the US Congress in February 1990, he refused the fundamental tenet of Marxist dialectics by a sentence that had for years puzzled a number of US legislators who were there. The sentence read, consciousness precedes being and not the other way around. Well, the congressman did not have to go through the torture of being force-fed Marx for years at school and university, but to those of us who were not so lucky, it was clear that what Havel was rejecting was the teaching about the primacy of the material base over the secondary superstructure. Or in other words, about the primacy of economy over ideas. And if you give a little thought to the evolution and history of the European Union, you can see that, this is what it started from a material base, the European communities of coal and steel, and with the idea of some community, real community of European citizens being secondary to the material base. You might well ask what has all this to do with Europe and its meaning, but one can only understand Havel's attitude to Europe, which was enthusiastic and skeptical in the same measure, against this background. That European integration was a good thing, and that the Czech Republic, for a number of practical reasons, ought to be a part of it, was never a question for him. The idea came naturally to him as a lifelong opponent of dividing lines and narrow nationalism, and an advocate of universal values and broad responsibility. Nevertheless, even before the Czech Republic joined the EU in 2004, 10 years, yeah, 10 years today, he publicly questioned some of the assumptions and the working methods it was being built on. In his first speech to the European Parliament in 1994, fully aware of how long the road would be that his own country still had to travel, what obstacles it had to overcome, and how much it would depend on the goodwill of the EU institutions, including the European Parliament, he did not stop at expressing his genuinely felt admiration for the European project, but went on to offer some critical reflections, which in retrospect could be seen as rather far-sighted. After praising the EU as an admirable work of the human spirit and its rational skill, and extolling its achievements in building the system of pan-European institutions, a single market, and the beginnings of a common currency, he went on to say, quote, "This admiration, almost exaltation, has however been mixed with a feeling which is less encouraging. What has been addressed was my reason rather than my heart," or you could say soul, unquote. What was missing in the European project, in Havel's view, was, quote, "a spiritual, moral, or emotional dimension. Various great empires which have brought some benefits for mankind," and you should know something about this in this country, "were not only characterized by their methods of administration and of organization, but were invariably imbued with a spirit, idea, ethos, and I wouldn't be afraid to say charisma, that in turn gave rise to their structure. They always had to offer some kind of a cue to the citizens as to how to emotionally identify with them, some ideal that could internally appeal to them and inspire them, some set of universally comprehensible values which everybody could fully share, and which would be valuable enough for the people to even make sacrifices on behalf of the entity that embodied them, in the extreme case, even their own lives." Unquote. Although the EU was based on a grand complex of civilizational values, Havel continued, quote, "Many people may have an understandable impression that the EU consists only in the never-ending arguments about how many carrots can be exported from one place to another, who will determine that number, who will supervise him, and possibly who will impose sanctions on those who violate the rules. That is why it seems to me perhaps the most important task that the EU is facing today is a new and real, clear consideration of what could be called European identity, a new and really clear articulation of the European responsibility, an enhanced interest in the very meaning of the European integration, and in its broader context in the contemporary world, and a new creation of its ethos, or if you wish, charisma. Reading the Maastricht Treaty, remember the Maastricht Treaty? A long time ago. Its historic importance notwithstanding, will hardly win the European Union genuinely enthusiastic supporters, real patriots, who will experience this complex organism as their real homeland, or as one of the levels of their homeland. Well, this was 1994. Whoever had misgivings about the potential of the Maastricht Treaty to inspire the people of Europe only had to wait to read the Lisbon Treaty, or at any rate, try to. I don't know anyone who did. In the meantime, the EU, particularly its advance guard of the Eurozone, became mired in a crisis which laid bare the limits of governments and even more of the people to identify with the ethos of the Union and to make the necessary sacrifices. In his speech to the Italian Senate in April 2002, in the last year of his presidency and at a time when the wave of Euro pride and Euro exceptionalism was reaching dangerous heights, Havel once again pointed to the, quote, immensely contagious, almost aggressive idea of continuous change, permanent progress, aggrandizement, enlargement, expansion, conquest, endless growth and endless growth of growth, as well as the idea of a perfect world which it is necessary to build peacefully, and if it doesn't work, by force, unquote, as ideas that are typically European. He also spoke out against the fetish of consensus and orthodoxy, which dismisses critical and alternative views on the nature, scope, and speed of European integration as anti-European, extremist, or crackpot, as I've learned in this country. Again, I'll quote, "The European history also includes the skeptics, the critics, the shy spirits who question all the realities of this world, and first of all themselves, and who are even able to brilliantly articulate their doubts. Or do not such personalities as Albert Camus, Franz Kafka, Samuel Beckett, Umberto Eco, and others embody the very tradition of European awe and European humility, which perhaps we should at this moment follow first and foremost," unquote. To sum up, for all his enthusiasm for the European project, Havel objected to its rationalistically utilitarian, materialist underpinnings. The idea so pronounced in the evolution of the European Union that by designing and implementing the institutions and decision-making procedures of a European polis, you can actually create such polis, would count as the original sin in his thinking. The impatience with which some of the people managing the project insists on an ever closer union, that's the buzzword, whose next progressive stage must be reached by a time certain or else the Union is in the danger of collapsing, would strike him as hubris. I believe it is obvious from the few excerpts I quoted how much Havel owes to Patočka and Husserl in reiterating the importance of understanding and soul as a cornerstone of any real European community, and how distant is the current European reality from this ideal. So the result is a paradox. In keeping with Patočka's teaching, Havel, a great European and a staunch advocate of European integration, was at the same time a fierce critic of how it went about the integration. In my view, the solution of the current European crisis is contained in this very paradox. Thank you very much.
Anya, Teresa, Teresa, please, go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for this very interesting speech and also for reconnecting the question of the meaning of Europe to its philosophical re-elaborations, and especially the one of Jan Patočka. I have some more concrete questions for you now. So, first of all, when you talk about, the Europe of the reason and the Europe of the heart, I think that you are perfectly right, and that discourse of Havel was really foreseeing. But at the same time, I have two questions to that respect. My first question would be, you mentioned that one of the debates that we are facing now, today, also before the elections of the European Parliament, is the one between two opposing positions. One camp is the one of the people advocating a deeper political integration, maybe only including some of the member states, so a core European Union where political integration would be more advanced. And the other camp instead is the one of those people saying that we have already gone too far with the integration of the European Union, and we have to get back to more intergovernmental positions. So I would first of all ask you, since you were talking about the Europe of the heart, would this mean that for you we have to instead go for a deeper political integration that does not only include economic regulations, but also the building of a true political community? So this is my first question. And my second question instead would be, you have, in a very right way, in my opinion, talked about the need for including citizens in the debate on the European Union. But how can this be done when the European elites, both the elites of the European Union and the national ones, have just demonstrated that they did not care about what the citizens were saying? And I refer to the fact that in 2004 there were two referendums in France and in the Netherlands concerning the European Constitutional Treaty, and the citizens of these two countries refused this treaty. And then in 2009, the same treaty basically has been instead approved by the parliaments of the member states, and it has been named Lisbon Treaty. And so I think that this has been a shock for the citizens of Europe, also because in these two countries, I was in France at the moment of the referendum, and there was really a lively debate among the citizens. So they were really caring about that issue. And then when you see that your opinion is not taken into account, and I don't know if you have ever read these two treaties, but really if you take the Constitutional Treaty and if you take the Lisbon Treaty, you will see that besides small differences, it's just the same text. So I think this was quite shocking, and maybe one of the reasons why we are in that situation now. So I would also ask you your opinion on that. Then I have another set of comments. And so always talking about the Europe of the heart, I would say that so far the European Union and the European integration has been based on two big ideals or values. After the Second World War, it was clearly the question of peace. So that was the main value or goal or moral, spiritual goal that motivated European integration. And it seemed that we had reached this goal, even though I would say that the Ukrainian situation now maybe makes us see that this peace is anyway always fragile. And then the second goal was the one of democracy, but especially concerning the countries belonging to the former Soviet bloc. So I would say that there is then a second phase that starts with 1989, where the main goal for the European Union was to integrate that part and to bridge the gap between the east and the west part of Europe. And this has been done also. So I would ask, what is left in terms of spiritual ideals to the European Union? Thank you.
Well, that's another long talk. But, first of all, I should make a caveat. I'm here representing myself, not my government, not the European Union. So whatever I say you can use against me, but not against my country. Now, you've described the situation quite nicely. In reality, it's even worse. The European Constitution, which the French and the Dutch rejected in the referendum, was a comprehensive text that, if you made an effort and had nothing better to do for a few days, you could really read through. The Lisbon Treaty, on the other hand, is basically an index to the European Constitution. It's a list of references to all the European treaties and acquis communautaire and new rules, etc., etc. You can't read it as a comprehensive text. So, some critics of the document, and I don't know any admirers of the document, say this was done on purpose so that, nobody could understand it to take a vote on it, This is not a kind of document that you can take a vote on. So now, what should we do? I mean, you pose these two alternatives, and my answer would be neither. And that's why I quoted the line of Havel about the importance of being able to wait and to have some room for reflection, for debate, for comprehension. It's just like a debate in the family. The wife wants to go to Mallorca, the husband wants to go to Iceland, and the children want to go to Disneyland. So there's no way you can frame the debate to provide an answer that would be satisfactory to the family. So what you do is you cook a dinner, you sit down, and you debate, and maybe out of the debate another alternative will come out, and you will go to Croatia, or maybe you decide to spare the money and don't go for a holiday, or maybe everybody should go on their own, whatever. So all of us mentioned the element of crisis. This is the time of crisis, and there's no pressing need to make any kind of far-reaching decisions at such a moment. There's time to make an inventory of what works, what doesn't. I mean, this is what the British government is trying to do in the review of the competencies program of the European Union that goes through all the all the areas of the competencies of the European Union and solicits opinion on whether they work or don't work, etc., etc. And so this is what you should do first and foremost. Now, what would be the other spiritual goals apart from peace and bringing in the communist part of Europe? Now, one obvious comment on this is that this is not a job yet done. There are other parts of Europe which are clearly parts of the continent which are not yet parts of the European Union. The Southeast Europe, what we used to call the Balkans until it stopped being politically correct, and then also the countries to the east of the current border of the European Union, Ukraine, Moldova, etc., etc. Now, obviously, this is not going to happen right now, and for more than one reason. First of all, there's no political will among the politicians in the European Union to do this, and there's no popular support for doing it. It appears that some member countries have enough of a job with absorbing the people who come to work to Britain or France or other countries, and that they have some misgivings about whether they not treated preferentially, whether they not abusing the welfare support that exists in the older member countries, which are richer and more prosperous, etc., etc. But and also there's no unanimity on the other side in Ukraine or in Moldova, whether they people there want it to happen. And even in Serbia, a country that probably would be next on many people's list if it came to another round of enlargement, even there the public opinion is far from being unanimous. So it's not going to happen, but that does not mean it should not be discussed, it should not be debated, and it should not be the eventual horizon of where Europe, what Europe will look like in the future. But this question also poses another question, and Havel often debated this question. It's rather controversial. The question is, if you want Europe to enlarge, you also have to say where it's going to stop, because you cannot enlarge it, infinitely, and that brings you back to the discussion of what makes Europe Europe, which ideas, what culture, what political principles comprise what we would call Europe. And again, this is a very worthy debate that we can spend time on, instead of arguing with each other whether we should integrate deeper or whether we should not integrate at all. The thing about deeper integration, the dumbest argument I've ever had is that some people in Brussels, unfortunately, make is that, we do have to keep building an ever closer union. We do have to keep integrating deeper, because if we don't, it's like cycling. It's like being on a bicycle, and if you stop pedaling, then you crash and fall. I mean, this can only be, invented by people who never rode a bicycle, because everybody who does knows that, if you stop pedaling, you just put your feet on the ground and stop, and I'll stop at this.
Thank you very much.
I'm so tempted to start about the cycling because, of course, Belgium is, the country of cyclists. And the thing is, of course, we cycle very fast, so stopping is a little dangerous. But I'm actually going to go somewhere else with my, my reflections. I'm going to start a little bit by more situating myself. So I'm Canadian. Probably you can pick up from your accent. I grew up with a very strong story of the European dream, the European project, the European peace and prosperity. This was something really put very much into my story as a child. And I have to say, I'm looking around this room, I'm imagining I'm not the only one. I'm imagining people here of different generations have also grown up, and maybe some people have heard first-hand narrations of what it was like during the war and what Europe was like, and really to recognize what we've come from, what was the situation. I think that may be something that is often forgotten. What was the inspiration for this project? And I think for me, I do think that's something we might have lost sight of, certainly this dream of prosperity, because it's come at the cost of what the reality is now austerity. I think, we've sort of sacrificed the dream of prosperity and taken on austerity. And this sort of struck me when I was recently in Brussels. If you're in Brussels at the European Union Institute, there's a flag telling the story of Europe, or the story the European Union would like us to tell of Europe. And the first flag shows the camps at Auschwitz with over the gate. Does anybody know what's over the gate? Right. And what's interesting is I was there, and I was thinking to myself, this is the time of the crisis in Greece. Something is really wrong when what is up there is actually seemingly returning to European history, where people are jumping off buildings in Spain, are starving in Greece, something is wrong, again, for austerity, for money. And I think the point you made about this connection between the material and the ideas is right exactly on that. There has been a real lost picture of the relationship, which I would put, in terms of the difference between important and urgent. So I think there are a lot of urgent things. Where am I going to work? Where are my children going to go to school? How am I going to have income? These are urgent questions that we want answered right away. But what has been sacrificed are the important questions. What is our principle? What are our long-term values? What do I want to pass on to the next generation? And I think confusing austerity and prosperity really is such that we've sacrificed what I would call the important questions, or the ideas. The one thing is, I think I disagree with you about what we need to do to, let's say, get back in touch with those ideas. The solution you've put forward, I'm not comfortable with. The solution you put forward is one where you're looking for culture and values and identity. And I would say, and again, I'm putting my cards on the table. I didn't actually say this already, but I have a Jewish background, so I've come into Europe with also a very clear picture of the Shoah, and I'm seeing things happening in Europe and the rise of the right, and certainly the headlines I read in some of your newspapers this morning broke my heart. Last year I was studying in London, and there was a mosque that was behind me that was burned. For me, the story of identity, of cultures, of value, I'm not comfortable with that. And I would actually say that perhaps Europe needs the exact opposite. Europe needs to sort of say, maybe it's a good thing the European Union isn't strong, doesn't have a strong identity. Perhaps, actually, sometimes the less constriction, the more freedom there are for the differences across Europe to engage. Perhaps, think about it this way, The more space the less rules there are, the more space there are for people to participate, to engage, to get involved, to put their own twists and differences. I mean, maybe to use a metaphor of a recipe, if you have too strict of a recipe, there's no room for your own additional touch or flavor. So I would say maybe we need to see what is called the weak Europe as actually very positive, as a space to allow for more participation, more involvement, and not a return to sort of the identity politics that are very dangerous, certainly in a culture where the right is rising. The talk of identity is dangerous talk. I mean, it's something I'm very concerned about. So while I agree with your analysis of the problem, I'm not so sure that identity is the solution. Another word you put forward, which I do think we should consider more, is responsibility. I think that if I think about the promise and the dream of Europe that I was, again, raised with, there is a responsibility to Europeans for themselves, but also for the rest of the world, to fulfill that promise, to get back to that promise. And that's a promise that, in a way, we need to take responsibility for, to creating the hope of peace and prosperity in Europe, but also in the world. I mean, I think when you said we can't talk about extending the borders, at one point, Europe conquered 80% of the globe. We do have a responsibility that goes beyond the small borders, because we've already crossed those borders throughout history. And I guess maybe I'll end with, what I often say to my children: a promise is a promise, and we need to keep it.
Absolutely. I don't think we disagree as much as we may think, but and it's true that to speak of identity is a tricky subject, because the extreme affirmation of identity, as you can see in the history of European nationalisms over the last 2 centuries, can lead to terrible things. But I would disagree with you in that you cannot avoid discussing identity. You have to find some kind of a space for identity, because without identity there's no community. Community is glued together. It's not just a universe of atomized individuals who have nothing in common. If it happens, but then it doesn't work. Even in Canada, and I've had some experience there, which also has a language divide, historical divides, etc., etc. But there is this mild version of national identity, of Canadians as being these nice, tolerant people who care about other people, who care about human rights, and who are not Americans. So I'm not advocating a strong definition of identity, but I do insist that without something we have in common, we cannot build, and we will be aware that we have it in common, we cannot build Europe. For me, one of the terrible things about the Eurozone are the banknotes. If there had been a discussion of what the banknotes will look like. And of course, there are all kinds of great European people, composers, writers, philosophers, who could be on the banknotes. There are all kinds of great European buildings, Colosseum, Eiffel Tower, Big Ben. You're not in the Eurozone, but yeah, that also could be on the banknotes. As now, in their infinite wisdom, the leaders of the Eurozone decided that there will be generic images on the banknotes that have no reality in the real world. You know, there is some kind of a bridge out of nowhere which doesn't exist on the banknotes. And this, in my mind, is a resignation on the commonality that something like a real European community would require. And on your second point, no, I don't have a second point.
I only made one point.
Thank you to all three of you for those very stimulating interventions. And now I really would like to turn it over to the audience, actually, for any questions you have, but also just comments. And your comments don't have to be limited to what has been discussed or to the issues that have been raised. So I see the highest hand, the gentleman right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was illuminating. We touched earlier on the shock, or perhaps not, of the attitudes of the elites towards the rejection of treaties. Yeah?
Sorry, I could hear a voice, but I couldn't see.
Sorry, it's okay. We touched earlier on the attitude of the elites towards basically what citizens of Europe want or don't want. And you mentioned the shock that was to many people. Maybe it wasn't so much of a shock to everyone. I've been reading recently a chap called Peter Mayer, the late political scientist, a book called Ruling the Void. And he's been saying for some time now that the dirigist top-down Europe we have reflects the deliberate intentions of its founders. And that the electoral preferences of the EU voters have no formal constraint on the policymakers. And basically that's how it was meant to be. Europe is an elite controlled sphere on which the sort of preferences of the voters and their representatives just have no impact whatsoever. If that is the case, all this hand-wringing about the democratic deficit and reform is meaningless because they've got it and they're going to keep it.
Somebody want to respond?
I mean, I would say, I mean, and again, can I have one of those little lines in front of me now saying, I am now speaking as an individual not connected to my university at all. I would actually say that if that is, and I would tend to agree with you, that's what Europe has become, I would say it can be reclaimed. I mean, I'm inspired by what we've seen across Europe. I was in London last year when there was this People's Assembly, and I was really impressed with people coming up and speaking. It was happening across Europe. I would say that's not a reason to quit. That's a reason to fight back and to get more involved. So, I mean, I agree with you, but then let's do something about it.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah. Well, this is a very troubling point because, you know, in one way you're right. There is in the writings of Schuman and other of the, you know, European fathers, there is so much of how should I put it? So much of deploring, you know, how the people of Europe are, you know, those people who are able to have this terrible war and they're not really reasonable enough to include in the decision making, and it is true that the European communities, coal and steel communities, were created with the explicit goal to prevent another war and to give rise to the project of the European integration, except, you know, the founders never said it publicly. You know, it's you know, we find it in the archives today, but it didn't exist at the time, and it was a mistake, yes. But at the same time, I agree with my neighbor. Fortunately, I mean, this is still a democratic continent and a democratic, a number of democratic countries. It's for those of us who had lived in the other system, the difference is quite striking. So we can reclaim it. It's we have the means, we have the laws, we have the legislation. It will not be easy because, of course, after 40 years of this, there are vested interests in keeping the project as it is, and not changing it, and that's why I believe, without sympathizing with many of the protest parties that are running in this upcoming election, that's why we will get the protest vote, because people want to have their say, and eventually they must.
My question concerns the notion of civil society. When I was at the Podashka Centenary Conference in Prague, there was a lot of discussion on that. And I was wondering if you have any insights about the relationship between civil society and the deficits or pluses in it, and the notion of Europe of the heart.
Civil society, I'm for it, but that's not saying much. Now, seriously, we've had, after 1989, when things changed, there was very little of civil society. There had been some institutions and networks of civil society before the Second World War. It was mostly destroyed by the Nazis and the communists afterwards. What little there was of it was in the opposition to the communist regime in the 70s and 80s. That was the kernel of the civil society. And after 1989, the idea that civil society is an essential element of any functioning democratic society that mediates, so to speak, between the individual, the citizen, and the government in many respects, and that in and of itself does some things that the government cannot or will not do, is not universally accepted. For many people in the political debate we have at home, civil society is just another name for interest groups, for vested interests. And I strongly disagree with that, but on the European level, it gets tricky when you realize how many of the civil society institutions are partly or wholly funded by the European Commission and the European institutions. So, the thing about civil society and institutions of civil society, they should be as independent as possible. I mean, this is, I'm sorry to say, not really independent.
Thank you very much so far. What part would you think that the breakdown of the social contract over the last 20 to 30 years, the idea of more that you don't do things for your community, that you do for money, whether by whatever process, deregulation of markets in the UK and in Italy over the last 20 years, cheap credit being made available in Italy, Ireland, Greece, the introduction of the euro, this idea that if you pump more cash in, that people no longer need to participate with each other, and no longer that you could just go out and buy it. essentially. And now, I think the best story I heard was G8 Summit about 2 years ago, just when everyone was talking about the end of the euro, just all those nights and so forth. There was a G8 Summit, and I think the finance minister for China came out, and they said to him, how do you feel about like this worldwide depression that we're going through? And I said, well, we're not going through a worldwide depression. What we call is the North Atlantic recession, because that's the only place it's happening.
That's a difficult question, I think. My personal answer, but again, I'm speaking on the. I mean, that's really my opinion, so it's nothing more than that. To be honest, I don't think. I mean, of course, it's a European and an American crisis. At the same time, I think that the European crisis, it's also a political crisis, so not only an economic crisis. And I think this has much to do with the first question. So on the way in which the European Union has been, the European integration has been turned into a project that excludes citizens' participation. And in my opinion, this is a crisis. I would call it a crisis of neoliberalism, in the sense that I think that this turn, I don't think that the European Union as an elite project was the dominant part of European integration from the beginning, but I think it became the dominant part from the 90s, so after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And yeah, so I would call it a crisis of neoliberalism, and as such, for me, it's a deep political crisis affecting especially the European identity, maybe more than the one of the United States, and that's why I would say that I really found interesting the idea of waiting. Also because I like it also as a philosophical idea, I think, but I'm not sure that we have the time to wait now. In the sense that when we have parties like Golden Dawn in Greece, the Front National in France, UKIP here, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, and right-wing parties also like Jobbik in Hungary, for example, I don't know if we have the time to wait.
So, you think that if we just forge ahead with more integration, it will make them go away?
I think that, first of all, one thing we need, I don't think that we can keep the euro like that. So I think there is really the need to reform at least the European Central Bank. And to decide if we want to keep the euro, we have to go for a fiscal integration. So I don't think that we can stay in a situation like this one for a long time. Otherwise, I really think that the Front National now scores, I mean, in the election forecast, it scores at 25%, being the first party, for example, in France, ahead of the socialists at the UMP. Maybe if we don't change the way at least the euro and the central bank works, maybe then it will be 30–35%. And okay, we are not scared now because we think that even if the anti-euro and right-wing forces in the European Parliament, even if they are going to have much more power than they had before, it's going to be anyway a minority in the Parliament, and still the way the European Parliament works makes the danger relatively low. But I think that it's not possible. I mean, the way this Europe is working, it's not sustainable, because in the countries, you really have a real situation of crisis, and it's not only. It used to be in the periphery, so-called periphery, like Greece, for example, with people of Golden Dawn going to the markets and stopping ONGs giving food to immigrants, for example. Now this is happening in Italy, now this is happening in France. So then, personally, I don't think the situation is sustainable as such.
But Teresa, if you have a fiscal union, which means you will have massive fiscal transfers from the more prosperous EU member countries to the less prosperous, mainly from Germany to the southern tier countries, the next thing you will get a Front National in Germany, and we've had that before. You know, I don't want to go there.
I mean, oh yes, sorry. No. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been observed that a popular movement inevitably crops up against limitations of its own understanding. And we talk about a post-Enlightenment response. And it's like someone's turned the light out. It's supposed to be an enlightenment. Was it a pseudo-enlightenment? Diana Call, co-chair of the BBC Trust, has written a book called Economics as if the Future Mattered. And that's written by Enlightenment Economics. And it provides a basis, along with the work of Sedlacek, which provides a Slavic sensibility to the European limitation, the economics of good and evil, along with economics as if people mattered, and putting this trinity of value and purpose and meaning together, we can reach a sustainable solution that can address the neoliberal crisis that is not just in politics, but is primarily an economic one.
Where are the women? Thank you. No women asked.
Can you go ahead with your question?
Okay. I have a question about Charter 77 and its relation to Europe, to idea of Europe, or the lack of this relation. Patočka, in one of Charter 77 texts, more exactly what we can expect from Charter 77 and what not, he explains at the beginning what Charter 77 already achieved, and mainly the attention of the whole world, what happens in Czechoslovakia and Eastern Europe. And the argument Patočka develops there reminds some kind of the creation, inauguration of a cosmopolitan public sphere, because the communist government are under scrutiny of the whole world and not of the Europe. And also, if I remember well the text of Declaration of Charter 77, those who signed the Charter 77 justify their protest in the name of universal values, of human rights, of Helsinki agreements, but not in the name of Europe. And it's quite interesting for me that it's some kind of cosmopolitan event and not necessarily related to the idea of Europe. Do you agree with my impression?
Well, to a large degree, yes. Historically, it is true that the Charter makes, and the founding declaration makes, a direct reference to the 1975 Helsinki Accords, which were the accords of what was called then the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, although it included the United States and Canada as two non-European countries. So there was a European framework, but in terms of ideas, it was a universalistic project which did not stop at the borders of Europe. And historically, it goes further back than Charter 77 or Patočka or Havel. I mean, the founder of the Czechoslovakia in 1918 at the end of the First World War, another philosophy professor, Thomas Maastricht, he wrote that the Czech question, as he put it, was either a global question or it was not a question at all, and he framed his political views with the universal principles and ideas in mind, rather than with any idea of nationalistic identity that you would object to.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear a discussion about Charter 77, now, 37 years past. because you don't often hear those discussions anymore, whatever the particulars of that discourse. Because when we talk about the meaning of Europe, it seems that on one hand you have this one level of discussion of meaning, which is technocratic, economic, bureaucratic, materialistic. Okay, that has to happen. But where is that broader discussion? Where you spoke, Ambassador, about the spiritual, and even used the word charisma, and Mr. Tarkovsky talked about European dream. I mean, that's not a phrase you often hear, the European dream. Maybe we need to at least, if not identify that exact meaning of the European dream, at least put it more into a spotlight and look at it and say, well, what could that mean? Let's have that broader discourse that's not merely technocratic, that will alienate people. And let's make the case for it, because otherwise we do come to that Yeatsian moment where the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passion and intensity, which seems to be the moment we're at least with Europe. So what is the vision for Europe? And I think that's the discussion that has to happen, and people need to be less fearful about at least attempting to have that discussion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, but I actually would say that, again, to come back, the discussion is in fact evidence of that European dream. One of the dreams of democracy, inclusion, equality is that you can disagree and you can debate and you can get engaged and you can participate. And that praxis of getting involved and being engaged with disagreements is precisely what, democracy is about and what the European dream, and it really was a phrase I grew up with. So for me, I don't think it's about identity. I don't want an essence. I want an activity. I want an engagement. I want a participation. So simply, you're right, leave the technocrats to do their, bean counting, and let's get engaged in discussion. But that's not happening because we are, getting a little bit lost with all the little urgent things and, of course, our smartphones. But maybe two thoughts connected to something somebody said. One thing I find strange, and I would love somebody here to tell me the answer, why is it the protest vote always goes to the right? If you're going to protest austerity, vote left. Don't vote right. The further right you go, the more austere you go. So I find that very strange. I'm trying to understand exactly what mechanism really makes it and that historically that keeps happening. But the other thing I think interesting is we seem to have forgotten a piece of history after World War II. Germany never paid its post-war debts. You're talking about, the right is going to be given, extra power if all of a sudden the rich countries give to the poor. But historically, several countries like Germany never paid its debt. It had huge post-war debt to many poor European countries now. Let it just pay it back. Well, let's ask for it 60 years later. No problems there.
And also, if I can just quickly add something, in 1980, for the reunification, Germany also received money from other European countries.
It's true. Merkel's not going to like us.
I have to say something which may be a little controversial, but I think it's a simplification if you characterize the protest vote as a right-wing vote. It's if you look in more detail at many of the parties, there is also a left-wing protest party in Greece, as far as I know. The clown party in Italy is neither left or right, and if you look at their programs, so they combine elements of right-wing nationalistic policies in some ways, and left-wing social economic policies in their platforms. And it makes sense. And if you look at the history of European extremism, at both the fascist party in Mussolini's party in Italy and the beginnings of Hitler's National Socialists in Germany, they were socialist parties, infected by nationalistic and racist extremism, and the combination, made the combustive cocktail, made them so attractive to many people and brought about the disaster that.
On the 13th of February this year, I found myself with my wife in Dresden. And the 13th of February is the anniversary, I'd forgotten this, is the anniversary of the bombing of Dresden. And in the early evening, we joined an anti-fascist demonstration when 13,000 people linked hands symbolically to surround the whole of Dresden. 13,000 people holding hands around the whole of Dresden as a symbolic barrier to the rise of fascism again. And the fascists were active in Dresden that night. It was frightening to see. And for 20 minutes, the bells tolled from the churches, and we stood in silence holding hands with complete strangers. And it brings tears to my eyes now. And that was the meaning of Europe for me. That was the meaning. It was.
And sadly, the
I
press
shall never
probably
forget
didn't even
that
cover
as
it,
long
huh?
as I live.
Sadly, the press probably didn't cover it.
It was covered in the Czech Republic and in Germany. I was staying in the Czech Republic actually at the time, and we'd just travelled for a day trip to Dresden. It was covered, but I think in this country there was virtually no coverage of it.
Yeah.
And so I've been very heartened by the way that the discussion has gone tonight at times, because I think those experiences, those feelings, those shared experiences are very important, and we should return to them again and again.
It's very encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. I know where I want to be February 3rd.
Sorry, we're trying to. We'll try to get to everyone. I'm heartened to see so many hands in the air. I think this gentleman's been waiting for quite some time, very patiently. Thank you.
The one with the glasses.
Well, just a small point you made about the banknotes in Europe, and wondering what we can do to replace the ones that are in. What symbols do we have of Europe? The first thought came to Eurovision Song Contest.
Yes.
European Football Union, maybe. Some of the big European companies, Amazon. Then you made another point later on about what went on before in Czechoslovakia, and what people like yourself lived through before the European Union existed. Maybe we should have something like the Berlin Wall, the gulags, something to remind us about where we've come from. And they might be more powerful symbols on the notes that we have.
Fair point.
We go to the gentleman with the beard and then the gentleman with the glasses, or we go the other way. That's fine.
Oh, who said that?
Sorry.
Sorry.
Well, maybe I can ask a woman to start off. My question is this. I've done a lot of work with communities, and what I've discovered very often is that communities in part define themselves as over and against who they're not as much as who they are. We are not them, we are us. And how can we apply that, in a sense, to Europe? Who are we not? And perhaps we could start with the Canadian, who's faced this.
You know? No, I have an answer to that, because, I mean, I really would say, you know who we're not? And I'm going to speak now using my Polish passport, so I'm going to be European for a moment. Who we're not who we were when we did what we did in the Shoah. That's who we're not. We're not our past selves, and we can do much better. That's who we should be. That's what I feel.
Okay, so, Ambassador, earlier you used Canada as an analogy to explain the kind of the way that a sort of soft identity can be effective for keeping people together. And I suppose this is for you as well, Professor Topolsky. I'm also Canadian. And the notion of Canada as a place where people are polite to each other and get along and care for the environment, all these things are a very big part of the myth of what Canadians are and what makes us Canadian. But in fact, in recent years, actually, we have our own culture of austerity, and we've seen that many of these things have been undermined. We have things like a massive voter suppression scandal, for instance, in the 2011 federal election. But people nonetheless persist in believing in this, that like often people, things like this are less scandalous for people because they don't believe that Canada is a place where that can happen. And I grew up with my own European dream, which is, for me growing up, Europe was a place of boundlessly high standards of living and countries that rank at the very top of the democracy index, things like this, and in some ways, these are slowly being eroded. In fact, unlike you, I have to disagree that I think identity politics are maybe a good ground for taking things, from taking power away from groups like the Golden Dawn and the Front National in France. And often you see this in the UK, actually, with a group like UKIP that's so opposed to the EU. It's all about Britain and Britain first, the same way the Front National is about France and France first. And all over Europe, you have these nationalistic movements that are against the EU. But on the other hand, we'd have to have a sense of identity that binds European countries together that doesn't have this kind of delusion of perfect democracy, anti-austerity, all these things, because in some ways those are being eroded, and I think people are turning to movements like UKIP because they no longer believe in an EU whose identity is so fragile that it can be shaken up by a financial crisis like we had in 2008.
Yeah, if I may. Well, I'm not proposing to re-erect the Berlin Wall, but you're right. In some ways, it had been easier for us to reflect on what is Europe when we were behind the wall and saw Europe in what we did not have. And if you look at it, and some people will deny it, but I think the elements of European identity are still there, and you could list them off as respect for the individual, respect for human rights, rule of law, respect for private property, and the moral codex that it's again not politically correct to say it, but that we inherited from our religious forefathers, and that had served us in good stead for a long time. And you don't need to add, very much more. Equality of genders, sexes, that came later. Respect for the environment we live in, that also came later. So we can add that to our identity, but you don't need much more than that. And if you contrast it with some other parts of the world, and I don't necessarily mean North Korea, you can see that it is a unique set of values and principles that would not automatically be recognized everywhere, and that I would suggest we should adhere to.
This is not a question with a question mark. It's an exclamation mark. I'm very intrigued about the European countries or country geographically who are not in Europe and still refuse to be in Europe. What have you got to say about that?
You mean Switzerland, or?
You know your geography better than I do, but I think there is one or two countries who are in Europe geographically, but who don't belong to the political Europe. And this intrigues me.
Look, I mean, I really think that there should be no obligation based on geographical position to join the European Union. Again, my feeling is that we've been through that. I mean, in the old days, there was a story or a joke that we told, and in the form of a question, and the question was, are the Soviets our friends or our brothers? And the answer was brothers, because friends you can choose. And and I don't want the EU to be like that.
Yeah, I have a question about the ethos of the European Union and this idea of shared values or common values, and I'm quite skeptical about that. I think so. skeptical about the idea of an identity. I also think that I agree that I think we need to go forward with a fiscal integration. I think anything else is not a solution. I'm also not worried about Germany that much. I think the German population would be happy if they knew the money went to Greece rather than to the German and French banks, which is, I think, the big problem. But but I am worried about this idea of shared values, and I think that even within Britain we don't share values. Right? We have an agreement on norms. We agree that it is important that we have freedom of speech, for example, but we might disagree on why we think it is important. So we might have different values attached to it. And I think we can't expect of something as big as the European Union to have agreement on values or shared values. So I think, yeah, I'm kind of distrustful of this idea of an ethos. I think there should be norms.
If I can just briefly answer on that.
Quickly?
Yeah. I would say that what the person speaking of Dresden before was saying is, for me, the only ethos or identity or value bringing together the European Union. So an identity based on anti-fascism and anti-Nazism. So that's for me it. And quickly also on the fiscal union, I just want to make clear that it doesn't mean that the Germans have to take out €1 from their pockets and give it to the Greeks. It's just, you know, making the European Central Bank the last borrower. So it's more about changing the system than really about moving money around.
I really like what, I mean, I'm going to sort of say, I'm going to bracket what you said because I want to think about it. I like it, but I'm not sure. But I kind of also, again, want to go back to the gentleman who was in Dresden. I think there is something more I would focus on. If we're going to let go of identity, the experience transformed him and everybody else with whom he was holding hands. So I would say what we would need is more action, experiences, shared experiences, engagement, participation, dialogue. These are things that transform us. One experience like this transforms you for life. Or I hope so. Maybe that's my idealism still coming through. But so I would say maybe not so much norms, but more experience, actions, performing together.
No? I'll try and get as many more companies. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question, if I could inject a slightly vulgar note of commercialism into the debate. I just wonder whether Europe actually markets the dream sufficiently well.
Well, I can say one thing, because this is a question I also think there's a real lack of, I mean, the importance of memory, historical memory. I mean, my first year in Belgium, there's a square in the town I live in called the Herbert Hoover Plain. And the students were protesting America and Bush. And I was like, what a sweet irony. You're protesting Bush and the Herbert Hoover Plain. They're like, who? Huh? What? And I was just like, really? Like the memory, the history. And so the European Union, the only thing I know they're doing is they're opening up a museum. The history and identity of Europe is supposed to be some kind of museum, but otherwise I've not heard of anything about trying to, you know, and of course it's in Brussels on the Schuman Square.
Thank you. Having worked with the European Commissioner as coming from a region, it's almost destroyed my love of Europe. Dealing with the European bureaucracy is something that can be soul-destroying. And then you go to the pub with the people you've been at the same meeting with, who come from Saxony, who come from Tuscany, who come from Ústí nad Labem in the Czech Republic. And then you remember, you sit around the pub and you have a drink and you get on together. And that's what, to me, being European is about. That you get on together in a shared environment and you have your discussions and nobody agrees on everything you say. But it's about sitting down and being in a place where you can enjoy each other's company in a sensible way.
Exactly. That's and for me, this is one of the dimensions of waiting, or it's active waiting. I am always vastly encouraged when I see, the numbers of Polish or Slovak or Czech students at every university in this country, in Europe, when I see British teachers in Prague and students as well. And it's, you know, they take some things that we still are getting used to, they take them for granted. They will not remember a time when things were different. So, and they don't need any bureaucrats or regulations to, you know, sit together and realize that they have, again, coming back to identity, like it or not, that they have so much in common.
All right. Speaking of all the things that we have in common, I know in the Czech Republic you have some really wonderful beers. We also have wonderful beer here in Bristol, actually. So I'd like to just present you with a small gift of a selection.
I don't have to drink it now.
You don't have to drink it all.
Thank you so
I also have, for our two, Anya, Belgium is also.
I know, I sort of was like, really?
Teresa, Italy, I'm sorry. Maybe we'll taste a good one. So let's give a warm
There's a maple leaf on it.
And really a warm thank you to all of you for your contributions. Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming to events like this.